The stars stretched endlessly before Commander Lisa Morgan. As she stood on the bridge of the horizon's edge and watched the void, through reinforced glass panels that showed her a universe humanity had been forbidden to truly explore for 300 years, and she wondered not for the first time why Earth's government accepted such limitations without question or rebellion against powers that claimed authority over human destiny far beyond the edges of known space, in a realm where dimensions folded upon themselves like paper origami. An ancient being named Silvara sat in meditation within her crystalline sanctuary, and her thoughts drifted across the cosmic web, sensing disturbances in patterns that had remained stable for millennia. And beside her massive form, coiled in restful sleep, lay Nethys, whose scales shimmered with colors that human eyes could not properly perceive, and whose breathing caused small ripples in the fabric of reality itself. Silvara opened eyes that held the wisdom of 10,000 years and gazed toward a particular section of the galaxy where a young species called humanity
now lived, confined to their small corner of space by decree of powers they did not fully understand. And she whispered
to her sleeping companion that perhaps the time had finally come for intervention, though she knew such choices carried consequences that would reshape everything on the administrative planet of Nexus Prime. A clerk named Vexter worked through his daily routine, processing thousands of documents with mechanical efficiency born from decades of tedious autocratic service, and he barely paid attention to the files scrolling past his multiple eyes as he approved denied or archived requests from countless worlds across the galactic community that had grown so large that no single being could comprehend its true scope. The file labeled Humanity Restricted Status Protocol came across his screen at the end of a particularly long shift, when exhaustion clouded his judgment, and Vexter saw what appeared to be a duplicate entry in the system database, and without reading the attached warnings or historical context, he deleted what he assumed was unnecessary redundancy and moved on to the next file, never realizing he had just removed the only legal protection preventing the galaxy from learning what humanity truly was. Lisa Morgan had no knowledge of galactic politics or ancient restrictions as she guided her ship through routine survey operations near the outer markers of permitted human space, and her crew of 12 worked, efficiently cataloging stellar phenomena and mineral deposits in asteroid fields that might one day support mining operations if Earth ever received permission to expand beyond their current boundaries. The ship's sensors detected nothing unusual in the surrounding space, and Lisa allowed herself to relax slightly as she reviewed reports from her science team led by Dr. Amy Brooks, whose enthusiasm for discovery made even mundane data seem exciting and together. They had spent 5 years mapping this region with meticulous care, hoping their work might convince the Galactic Council to grant humanity more freedom unknown to them. 3 Croxal scout ships had detected their presence, and were even now analyzing the human vessel with predatory interest, and the reptilian warriors aboard those ships checked their databases for information about this species and found to their surprise that no restriction warnings appeared in the updated files, and according to current galactic law, this made humanity fair game for conquest or exploitation back in her dimensional sanctuary. Silvara felt the shift in probability streams, and her eyes widened as she recognized the pattern of violence about to unfold, and she reached out to wake Nethys with gentle urgency, and the dragon stirred, raising his enormous head to regard his ancient econ companion with intelligence that surpassed most mortal beings. Nethys could sense what troubled Silvara even before she spoke, and together they had witnessed countless civilizations rise and fall across the ages, but something about humanity had always intrigued them both, and the dragon rumbled deep in his chest, a sound that resonated across dimensional barriers, and Silvara nodded in agreement. Knowing they could not remain passive observers any longer, though, Croxal commander aboard the lead scout ship made his decision quickly, and transmitted orders to his small fleet to shadow the human vessel and gather intelligence about their capabilities and defenses, and he felt confident that this would be an easy assessment given that humanity has been classified as a minor species with limited technology and no significant military presence beyond their home system. Lisa Morgan continued her duties, unaware that her ship had become the focus of hostile attention, and she reviewed crew schedules and planned the next phase of their survey mission while thinking about her family back on Earth and wondering if her daughter had received the last message she sent 3 weeks ago. When they passed near a communication relay station, Rester completed his shift and went home to his small apartment on Nexus Prime, where he ate a simple meal and reviewed entertainment broadcasts from various worlds, and he gave no thought whatsoever to the files he had processed that day or the fact that he had just altered the course of galactic history with a single careless deletion. In his evening passed in unremarkable comforts, Lavara began preparations for what she knew must come, and she gathered artifacts of power that had lain dormant for thousands of years. Since the fall of her own civilization, and Nethys stretched his wings, causing local space to ripple and distort as his form shifted between dimensions, and both ancient beings understood that emerging from their long exile carried risks, but remaining hidden while catastrophe unfolded was no longer acceptable. Croxel scouts finished their initial assessment and transmitted their findings back to the nearest military outpost, where officers reviewed the data with growing interest and saw opportunity in the apparently defenseless human research vessel, and they began formulating plans for a demonstration of power that would establish their empire's dominance over this new prey. Species Lisa Morgan finally retired to her quarters after a long duty shift and lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling of her small cabin in thought about all the mysteries the universe held just beyond humanity's reach, and she dreamed of a future where humans could explore freely without restrictions imposed by species they had never met face to face, and whose motivations remained unclear. 3 days passed in relative peace as the horizon's edge continued its survey work, and the Croxel scouts maintained their distance while waiting for reinforcements. And Silvara made her final preparations, knowing that once she and Nethys revealed themselves, there would be no returning to the comfortable isolation they had maintained for so long. And Earth military planners reviewed reports from various research vessels, including Lisa Morgan's ship, and they noted nothing unusual in the data streams and continued with their own secret projects hidden deep within the asteroid belt and on the dark side of Luna, where humanity had been building and preparing for 3 centuries without drawing galactic attention to their true capabilities. The Croxel reinforcements arrived in the form of a strike cruiser commanded by an ambitious officer named Thrax, who saw the opportunity to gain glory and advancement by conquering new territory, and he ordered immediate action against the nearest human settlement, which happened to be a mining colony on a distant moon called Callisto Station, where 2,000 civilians lived and worked in relative Pessilvera. Sensed the moment of violence approaching like a storm building on the horizon, and she looked at Nethys with ancient sorrow, knowing that what came next would unleash forces that had been restrained for far too long, and the dragon's eyes glowed with inner fire as he prepared himself for the role he must play in the events that would soon reshape the galaxy. 3 months had passed since the bureaucratic error, and during that time the Croxel Empire expanded its scouting operations into regions previously marked as restricted, and their aggressive nature found fertile ground in the absence of legal barriers that once protected lesser species from exploitation. And Conquest Commander Thrax stood on the bridge of his strike cruiser watching the view screen display a small human mining colony that clung to the surface of a barren moon, and he saw easy prey in the modest defensive installations and civilian infrastructure that spoke of a species unprepared for real warfare, and his reptilian features twisted into what passed for a smile among his kind. The attack began without warning, as plasma cannons tore through the thin atmospheric domes protecting Callisto Station, and alarms shrieked throughout the colony as 2,000 people scrambled desperately for emergency shelters that had never been designed to withstand military-grade weapons, and mothers grabbed children while workers abandoned their posts in mining tunnels deep beneath the surface. Captain Amy Brooks commanded the patrol ship Defiant on routine security duty 3 light hours away when the distress signal reached her vessel, and she immediately ordered maximum acceleration toward the colony coordinates. While her crew prepared for combat engagement, and she felt cold dread settling in her stomach, as she calculated they would arrive far too late to prevent whatever was happening. The massacre lasted 17 minutes from first strike to final silence, and Thrax broadcast the entire event across multiple galactic variation channels as a demonstration of Croxal's superiority over weak species that dared occupy valuable territory without proper military strength, and he laughed as human structures crumbled in life. Signs winked out on his tactical display. Mammy Brooks arrived to find debris field, where a thriving community had existed just hours before, and her sensors detected no survivors among the wreckage that tumbled slowly through space, and she ordered her crew to begin recovery operations, knowing they would find only bodies and shattered dreams in the ruins of Callisto, stationed among the floating debris. Amy's tactical officer located a single intact item that the scanners identified as a child's toy. They brought it aboard using a recovery drone, and Amy held the small stuffed bear named Mr. Whiskers in her shaking hands, and found a data chip sewn into its fabric that contained the final moments recorded by someone who wanted the truth preserved. Amy watched the recording alone in her quarters and saw mothers shielding children with their own bodies, and workers trying desperately to seal breaches in the habitat domes, and she heard the screams and pleas and defiant curses hurled at attackers who showed no mercy. And when the recording ended, she sat in silence for a long time before composing her report. The transmission from Amy Brooks reached Earth Command within 6 hours, and military officers gathered in secure facilities to watch the recovered footage and review the tactical data from the attack. And Admiral Kate Harrison sat at the head of the conference table with her face carved from stone as she absorbed every detail of the atrocity committed against defenseless civilians around. The table voices rose in anger, demanding immediate retaliation, but Kate Harrison raised one hand in silence, fell across the room, and she spoke quietly, saying that rage must be channeled into purpose, and that humanity had prepared for this moment across 3 centuries of enforced isolation, and now the time had come to show the galaxy what humans truly warders went out through encrypted military channels, reaching hidden facilities throughout the solar system, and massive doors opened in asteroid bases, revealing construction yards that had operated in secret since humanity first encountered the Galactic Council, and learned they were viewed as potential threats to be contained rather than quills to be welcomed. Kate Harrison authorized the awakening of the fleet and watched on her displays as hundreds of warships began activation sequences, and crews who had trained for generations in simulation and exercise now moved to their battle stations, knowing that everything humanity had built in shadow would soon be revealed to a galaxy that thought them. Wixelvara felt the shift in cosmic patterns as human civilization mobilized for war, and she turned to Nathia, saying that the moment approached when they must choose between continued isolation or Nathos, active participation in events that would reshape galactic civilization. And the dragon rumbled his agreement, understanding that their long exile was ending. The Croxal Empire celebrated their easy victory over the human colony, and Thrax received commendations from his superiors, who praised his aggressive expansion into unprotected territory, and they began planning additional strikes against human holdings, believing they had found a species ripe for conquest and subjugation. Amy Brooks delivered her full report in person to Kate at Earth Command and stood at attention while the Admiral reviewed every detail. And when Kate finally looked up from her display, she saw something in the captain's eyes that matched her own controlled fury, and she asked Amy if she wanted to lead. The response, accepted the assignment without hesitation, and Kate Harrison explained that she would command a special operations group tasked with locating and identifying every Croxal military installation within 5 sectors, and that her ship would be equipped with technologies the galaxy had never seen because humanity had learned long ago to hide their greatest achievements. Defiant underwent rapid modifications in a secret orbital facility where engineers installed weapons systems that could tear through conventional shields and drives that bent space in ways that should have been impossible for a species so young. And Amy watched the transformation of her vessel, understanding she now commanded something that would terrify those who had grown complacent in their power across Earth and throughout the solar system. Humanity prepared for war with methodical precision. born from centuries of planning and training, and civilian populations were evacuated to secure bunkers while military forces deployed to strategic positions, and the truth about human capabilities began spreading through encrypted networks that the Galactic Council had thought themselves safe. From Silvara began the process of manifesting her physical form in normal space after thousands of years existing between dimensions, and the effort required was tremendous energy that Nethys helped channel through their ancient bond, and together they prepared to reveal themselves to humanity and offer knowledge that might prevent total galactic annihilation. The Galactic Council received reports of unusual activity in human space, but their bureaucratic processes moved slowly, and by the time analysts recognized the significance of the data points indicating military mobilization, it was already too late to prevent what came next. Kate Harrison stood before assembled military commanders and delivered the order that would change everything, and she spoke of Callisto Station and the 2,000 innocent lives taken by an empire that thought humans would accept such aggression without response, and her words were measured, but her eyes burned with controlled fury. Fleet began moving into attack positions, and hundreds of warships that should not have existed emerged from hiding places throughout the solar system, and their formations spoke of tactical doctrine far more advanced than anything humanity had publicly demonstrated, and sensor arrays across the galaxy began detecting the anomalous readings. Rooks led her task force toward the first Croxal target, and her crew worked with efficiency born from endless training, and she thought about the stuffed bear still secured in her quarters, and promised the ghosts of Callisto Station that their deaths would not go unanswered. Thrax received warnings from his intelligence officers about unusual activity in human space, but dismissed the reports as impossible because humanity lacked the capability for serious military resistance, and he continued planning his next attack, unaware that he had awakened something far more dangerous than his empire could comprehend. The galaxy received its first true glimpse of humanity when General Claire Bennett led the assault fleet out of Sol System, and her flagship Retribution measured 15 kilometers in length, with armor plating that could withstand sustained bombardment. From weapons designed to crack planets, and the vessel bristled with technologies that made Galactic Council scientists question everything they thought they knew about human capabilities. Claire stood on the command deck surrounded by holographic displays showing fleet positions across multiple star systems, and she issued orders with calm precision while her tactical officers coordinated movements of 300 warships that had been hidden in plain sight for generations, and the general allowed herself a small smile, knowing the galaxy was about to learn an expensive lesson about underestimating humans. The Croxal Empire mobilized its full military strength in response to reports of human fleet movements, and Commander Thrax found himself reassigned from his celebration to defensive positions around the Empire's primary military installation at Proxima 3, and he gathered his forces with confidence born from 40 successful conquests, and prepared to crush what he assumed would be a desperate human counterattack. Kami Brooks led the Vanguard fleet that would strike first, and her modified Defiant cut through space at speeds that should have torn the ship apart, but human engineers had solved problems with faster than light travel that other species still struggled to understand in her. Tactical display showed Croxal forces gathering in defensive formations that assumed conventional warfare tactics. Silvera and Nethys completed their transition into normal space and materialized aboard the Retribution in a cascade of light that caused alarms to shriek throughout the massive warship in security. Teams rushed to the bridge with weapons ready until they saw what had appeared, and Claire Bennett stood calmly facing the ancient elf woman and her dragon companion without drawing her. Sidearm the general studied Silvara with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and she noted the power radiating from both visitors and the way reality seemed to bend slightly around their forms, and she asked in a level voice whether they had come to help or if they represented another threat that humanity would need to eliminate. Taliva smiled with genuine warmth for the first time in 1,000 years, and she explained that she had watched humanity for centuries, waiting to see if they would repeat the mistakes of her own people or forge a different path, and she offered knowledge and partnership in exchange for the chance to finally act against forces that had destroyed her civilization long ago, Claire. Listen to Silvara's story about the hierarchy and the pattern of genocide used to eliminate species that showed too much promise, and she understood that the Croxel were merely tools of greater powers that had ruled the galaxy through manipulation and controlled violence for tens of thousands of years, and she accepted the ancient elf's offer, knowing humanity would need every advantageousness, stretched his wings, causing spatial distortions that made the Retribution's sensors scream warnings, and the dragon spoke directly into the minds of everyone on the bridge, saying that he had not tasted battle in ages beyond counting, that he looked forward to reminding the galaxy why his kind had once been feared. The Battle of Proxima 3 began, when Amy Brooks dropped her fleet out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Croxel defensive perimeter and immediately launched coordinated strikes against their sensor arrays and communication hubs, and the attacks came with such precision that Thrax's forces found themselves blind and unable to coordinate before they fully understood they were under assault. Claire Bennett brought the main battle group in 3 minutes. Later, the Retribution led a formation that smashed through Croxel defensive lines like a hammer through glass, and human weapons tore apart shields that had protected the Empire through dozens of wars, and Thrax watched in growing horror as his superior numbers meant nothing against technology he could not counter. The battle lasted 11 minutes from first contact to final Croxel surrender, and in that time humanity demonstrated capabilities that rewrote galactic understanding of warfare, and they targeted military installations with surgical precision while avoiding civilian casualties and preserving infrastructure, and the message was clear that humans could destroy their enemies completely, but chose restrain. Thrax survived long enough to transmit desperate warnings to his superiors before human marines breached his command ship and took him prisoner, and he found himself face to face with Amy Brooks, who carried a small stuffed bear, as she informed him that he would stand trial for war crimes, and that his empire's reign of terror had ended. News of the battle spread across the galaxy faster than light through quantum communication networks, and the Galactic Council convened emergency sessions while member species tried to understand how humanity had hidden such power for so long and why their intelligence services had failed to detect the massive military build-up in Sol System. Kate Harrison addressed the council via secure transmission and explained that humanity had accepted their restricted status 300 years ago, while secretly preparing for the day when the galaxy would inevitably threaten them. And she made clear that humans sought only equality and respect, but would defend themselves with overwhelming force if necessary. The council chambers erupted in chaos as various species demanded explanations or called for immediate action against the human threat, and some advocated appeasement, while others pushed for military response. And no one seemed to notice that their databases still showed no record of why humanity had been restricted in the first place. Fexter, the clerk who had deleted the crucial file, finally learned what his careless action had caused, and he sat in his small apartment watching news broadcasts about the battle and human fleet movements, and he felt sick with the knowledge that he had triggered events that might lead to galactic war. Silvara stood beside Claire Bennett on the bridge of the Retribution and used her ancient knowledge to analyze galactic council communications, and she detected patterns that confirmed her worst suspicions about the hierarchy's involvement, and she explained to the general that the Croxel attack had been orchestrated to test human responses before a much larger threat emerged. Claire ordered her fleet to defensive positions around key human installations while maintaining forward elements ready to strike anywhere in the galaxy. And she knew that the real war had not yet begun, and that everything so far had been merely the opening moves in a conflict that would determine whether humanity survived or joined the countless species. The hierarchy had Amy Brooks return to Earth's orbit with Thrax and other Croxel prisoners in custody, and she finally allowed herself to feel the weight of what had happened at Callisto Station and what she had done in response, and she placed the stuffed bear in a memorial shrine dedicated to those who died, and promised their memories would not be forgotten. These flew through the void between stars, testing his power after ages of dormancy, and everywhere he passed, ships from various species fled in terror at the sight of a true dragon moving through space as if it were air, and he laughed at their fear, knowing that he and Silvara had chosen the right allies in humanity. The Croxal Empire collapsed within weeks as subjected species rose in rebellion, and human forces provided support to freedom. Movements that had waited generations for the chance to overthrow their oppressors, and Claire Bennett coordinated liberation operations that freed billions while demonstrating that humanity fought for principles. Beyond mere conquests, Kate Harrison received intelligence reports about mysterious ship movements in deep space and patterns, suggesting coordination between species that had never cooperated before, and she shared this data with Silvara, who confirmed that the hierarchy was beginning to mobilize against the threat humanity represented. The Galactic Council fractured into competing factions as species debated whether to appease humanity or oppose them, and the bureaucrats who had grown comfortable in their power struggled to comprehend that the order they maintained for millennia was crumbling, and arguments raged through council chambers. While member species chose sides based on fear or opportunity, Lieutenant Maya Scott worked in military intelligence, analyzing communication intercepts and data patterns that seemed random, until she applied human analytical methods that other species had never developed, and she began noticing coordination between 7 elder species that officially maintained neutral positions in galactic affairs, but whose actions suggested hidden purpose. Maya brought her findings to Kate Harrison and spread data across
Holographic displays showing ship movements and encrypted transmissions that formed a pattern of deliberate preparation, and the Admiral studied the information with growing
concern, realizing that the Croxal attack had been merely a test designed to measure human capabilities before a real assault began. Called Claire Bennett back from the frontier and gathered her senior commanders for a classified briefing, where Maya presented evidence of the hierarchy and explained that 7 ancient species had secretly controlled galactic civilization for tens of thousands of years and used lesser races as proxies to eliminate promising species before they became threats. Silvara attended the briefing and confirmed Maya's analysis with her own knowledge of the hierarchy's methods, and she described how they had destroyed her people when the elves developed technology that threatened established power structures. And she explained that the hierarchy viewed extinction as acceptable collateral damage in maintaining their vision of galactic stability. The ancient elf showed them historical records she had preserved from before her civilization fell, and humans watched in silence as entire species vanished from existence, with their achievements erased and their worlds sterilized, and Silvara's voice remained steady as she described watching her home burn while she and Nethys fled into dimensional exile. Claire asked how many species the hierarchy had eliminated, and Silvara responded that she knew of 43 confirmed extinctions but suspected the true number was much higher because the hierarchy destroyed all evidence of their victims and rewrote historical records to hide their crimes. Amy Brooks, who had been promoted to fleet captain after the Battle of Proxima III, studied the data and asked the obvious question about whether humanity could survive against an enemy that had successfully destroyed so many others, and the room fell silent as everyone contemplated the implications. Kate Harrison stood and addressed her officers, saying that humanity had spent 3 centuries preparing for exactly this scenario, and that every simulation and wargame had assumed they would eventually face overwhelming opposition. And she explained that human survival strategy had never relied on superior technology alone, but on adaptability and alliance building. Maya Scott revealed the second phase of her intelligence work, showing that she had identified resistance movements within dozens of species currently subjugated by hierarchy client states, and she proposed that humanity could turn the hierarchy's own strategy against them by arming and supporting rebellions across the galaxy. Materialized on the command deck in his full draconic form, filling the massive chamber, and he spoke of the dragon clans that had been hunted nearly to extinction by the hierarchy, and explained that survivors still existed in hidden places throughout the galaxy and would rally to any banner that promised revenge against their ancient enemy. Silvara added that the elf refugees scattered across dimensional exile numbered in the thousands and possessed knowledge and abilities that could counter the hierarchy's advantages, and she offered to serve as ambassador to these hidden communities if humanity would accept their alliance. Claire Bennett began strategic planning for a multi-front campaign that would liberate subjected species while defending human space against the coming hierarchy assault, and she worked with her tactical staff to develop coordination protocols for an alliance. His force composed of dozens of different species. With varying capabilities, Captain Rachel Kim commanded humanity's stealth reconnaissance fleet, and she led missions deep into hierarchy-controlled space-gathering intelligence about enemy fleet positions and defensive installations in her ships. Used experimental cloaking technology that rendered them invisible to conventional sensors. Rachel's reconnaissance revealed the hierarchy, assembling an armada that dwarfed anything in recorded history, and the enemy was pulling ships from garrison duty across 1,000 worlds and concentrating forces for what appeared to be a genocidal campaign against humanity and any species that allied with them. Intelligence reached Earth Command, and Kate Harrison called an emergency session with civilian government leaders to present the evidence and explain the choice facing humanity, and she laid out the options of surrender and subjugation, or resistance. Against impossible odds, the vote among Earth's leadership was unanimous for resistance. And the president addressed the global population, explaining the situation and calling for total mobilization of resources in every human. Understood that they faced potential extinction, but chose defiance over submission. Claire Bennett accelerated fleet deployment and human warships spread across defensive positions, while strike groups prepared to carry the fight into enemy territory, and she coordinated with Silvera and Nethys. Integrate elf magic and dragon power into human tactical. Dr. Maya Scott established communication with resistance leaders throughout the galaxy, using encrypted quantum channels that the hierarchy could not intercept, and she promised human military support and advanced weapons to any group willing to rise against their oppressors. Zamie Brooks took command of the Liberation Task Force and led combined human and rebel fleets in strikes against hierarchy supply lines and staging areas, and each successful raid freed more slaves and recruited more allies while demonstrating that the hierarchy could be beaten. Vexter the clerk, who had started everything, finally came forward and confessed his role in deleting the human restriction file, and he offered to testify about hierarchy influence within the Galactic Council bureaucracy, and Kate Harrison granted him protection in exchange for his cooperation. Silva worked with human scientists to develop hybrid technologies combining elf-dimensional manipulation with human engineering, and the results exceeded expectations as they created weapons and defenses that operated across multiple planes of reality simultaneously, led dragon survivors in attacks against hierarchy forward bases and the site of dragons fighting alongside humans, sent shockwaves through enemy forces. Who had thought such creatures extinct? And the ancient beings proved that they had lost none of their terrible power. Hierarchy leadership met in secret to discuss the human problem, and they agreed that humanity represented an existential threat to their control and must be eliminated completely along with any species foolish enough to ally with them, and they authorized the use of weapons banned for thousands of years. Kim intercepted communications revealing the hierarchy's plan to use dimensional weapons. It's capable of destroying entire star systems, and she rushed the intelligence back to Kate Harrison, who understood they were running out of time to prepare for the final confrontation. Claire Bennett proposed a bold strategy to force the hierarchy into battle at a location of human choosing rather than allowing them to attack Earth directly, and she selected the Edge of Silence, a neutral zone at the galaxy's rim where space was thin and dimensional barriers weak. Kate Harrison approved the plan and issued orders for all human forces to concentrate at the Edge of Silence, while Amy Brooks led the liberation fleets in a massive, coordinated, doughty, rising designed to draw hierarchy attention away from the main fleet. Silvara and Nethys agreed that the Edge of Silence was an ideal battlefield, because the dimensional instability there would enhance their abilities while limiting the hierarchy's advantage in numbers, and the ancient elf began preparations for the largest magical working she had attempted since the fall of her civilization. Maya Scott continued recruiting allies and discovered that species the hierarchy thought firmly under control harbored deep resentment and willingness to rebel if given hope, and weapons and human agents spread across the galaxy, arming and training resistance fighters. Hierarchy Armada began moving toward the Edge of Silence and their 3,000 warships, represented the largest military force assembled in galactic history, and they came with the intention of erasing humanity from existence as a lesson to any species that might challenge established order. The Edge of Silence lived up to its name as human forces gathered in the darkness between spiral arms where stars were scarce and the fabric of space grew thin, and Claire Bennett stood on the bridge of the Retribution, watching her fleet take defensive positions, while behind her, Silvara and Nethys prepared themselves for the battle that would determine the fate of Galactic civilization. The Hierarchy Armada arrived in overwhelming force, with 3,000 warships supported by conscripted vessels from 100 subjugated species, and their commanders expected to find desperate humans making a last stand, and instead they discovered something that made their tactical officers recalculate their assessments in disbelief. Human ships held position in perfect formation, but they were not alone. In a raid beside them floated vessels from dozens of species that supposedly submitted to hierarchy control, and behind those ships dimensional rifts opened as elf refugees emerged from exile, bringing weapons and knowledge preserved from before the fall of their civilization. Admiral Kate Harrison broadcast a message across all channels telling the hierarchy forces that they faced not just humanity, but an alliance of every species tired of living under tyrannical control, and she offered surrender terms that would spare lives if the hierarchy stood down immediately. Hierarchy commanders laughed at the offer and ordered their forces to advance, confident that superior numbers would crush the rebellion regardless of how many inferior species joined humanity, and they had destroyed civilizations before and saw no reason this time would be different. Claire Bennett gave the order to engage, and human weapons spoke with thunder that echoed across dimensional barriers, and the first hierarchy ships to enter range discovered that their shields could not stop weapons that phased between realities before striking, and their armor meant nothing against kinetic projectiles accelerated to relativistic speeds. Silvara raised her arms, and dimensional energy flowed through her as she channeled power accumulated across 10,000 years, and space itself tore open in massive rifts that scattered hierarchy formations and sent enemy ships tumbling through reality storms that physics could not explain. These grew to impossible size as he drew on the dimensional instability of the Edge of Silence in his form. Stretched across kilometers of space, as he became something between dragon and living weapon, and he tore through enemy dreadnoughts with claws that cut through hull plating like paper. Commander Nicole Wright led the Allied fleet composed of liberated species whose ships had been upgraded with human technology, and they struck at hierarchy supply lines while targeting command vessels, and the conscripted forces found themselves fighting beside people they had oppressed for generations. Zamie Brooks piloted a fighter squadron in close support of the Retribution, and her pilots flew with reckless courage born from grief, transformed into purpose, and she thought about Callisto Station and the 2,000 ghosts who deserved to see their killers face justice. The battle raged across three-dimensional planes simultaneously as Silvara manipulated reality to give human and allied forces advantages while limiting hierarchy ability to concentrate their numerical superiority, and the ancient elf sang words of power in a language older than most stars. Maya Scott coordinated the information warfare campaign, broadcasting the truth about the hierarchy's crimes across every communication channel and showing the galaxy classified records that proved thousands of years of genocide and manipulation, and species that had served the hierarchy began questioning their loyalty. Rachel Kim led stealth ships and precision strikes against hierarchy flagship command centers, and her teams planted data bombs that released damning evidence directly into enemy communication networks, and conscripted crews began seeing the truth about who they served. The hierarchy leadership watched their careful plans disintegrate as subjugated species turned against them, en masse, and rebellion spread across the galaxy faster than they could respond, and they had never faced unified resistance before, and their tactics assumed compliance. Born from Fernethes, engaged the largest hierarchy dreadnought in single combat, and the Dragon's Fury made dimensional space scream as he ripped the massive vessel apart and broadcast his roar across subspace frequencies that dragons had used to communicate when his kind ruled the stars. Claire Bennett directed human forces with tactical brilliance. Learned from centuries of simulation and preparation, and every move had been war-gamed countless times, and she knew exactly how to counter hierarchy advantages while exploiting their overconfidence. Brooks received new orders and led her squadron on a desperate run toward the hierarchy. Command flagship, where the 7 leaders of the ancient conspiracy directed the battle, and she knew this was a suicide mission, but accepted it anyway because some victories required ultimate sacrifice. Fighter squadron broke through defensive screens, and Amy piloted her craft into the flagship's command center, and instead of firing weapons, she activated a powerful transmitter that broadcast everything she had learned about the hierarchy across the galaxy, and the truth could not be stopped or hidden any longer. Species across the galaxy saw the evidence of crimes committed against their ancestors and learned that the peaceful order they believed in was built on mountains of corpses and lies, and the hierarchy's own people discovered that their leaders had manipulated them. Millennia conscripted forces defected en masse as crews realized they were fighting to preserve a system built on genocide and oppression in the hierarchy. Armada began disintegrating from within as ships switched sides or simply stopped fighting. Kate Harrison watched the tactical display as enemy formations collapsed, and she ordered human forces to accept surrenders and protect ships that lowered their weapons, and she made clear that humanity sought liberation, not conquest. Silva felt the shift in galactic consciousness as billions of beings awakened to truth long hidden, and she knew the hierarchy's control was broken forever, and she reached out to Nethys through their ancient bond, sharing satisfaction that they had finally avenged their people. The battle ended not with a final explosion, but with a wave of surrenders as hierarchy forces abandoned their leaders and conscripted species joined the rebellion, and only the 7 ancient leaders fought to the bitter end, refusing to accept that their reign had ended. Claire Bennett took personal command of the operation to capture the hierarchy leadership, and human marines stormed their flagship after Silvera neutralized their dimensional defenses, and the ancient beings who had ruled the galaxy for so long faced justice at human hands. The aftermath saw the formation of a new galactic order based on equality rather than domination, and Kate Harrison addressed the assembled species, explaining that humanity sought partnership, not empire, and that every civilization deserved the chance to reach for the star. Silvara and Nethys emerged from their exile permanently and took positions as advisors to the new council, where their ancient wisdom helped guide younger species, and the elf woman finally allowed herself to grieve for her lost people while celebrating that their sacrifice had meaning. Lisa Morgan, the scientist who had commanded the Horizon's Edge at the beginning, returned to exploration and led the first joint expedition into unexplored space, and humans, elves, dragons, and dozens of other species ventured into the unknown together as equals. Amy Brooks survived her desperate attack on the hierarchy flagship and received commendation for bravery, but she cared more about the memorial built at Callisto Station, where the names of 2,000 victims were carved in stone that would endure forever. Maya Scott became head of galactic intelligence for the new alliance, and her network prevented the rise of new tyrannies while supporting democratic movements across thousands of worlds, and she proved that information could be as powerful as weapons. Rachel Kim continued leading reconnaissance missions and discovered hidden worlds where species had fled hierarchy persecution, and she brought news that the galaxy was larger and more diverse than anyone imagined. Vexter, the clerk whose mistakes started everything, found redemption by helping establish transparent government systems that prevented the kind of bureaucratic corruption that had enabled the hierarchy, and he spent his remaining years ensuring no one could delete truth. Again, the galaxy learned that humanity's greatest weapon had never been their ships or technology, but their refusal to accept that might made right, and their willingness to fight for principles rather than power, and they offered something the hierarchy never had, which was hope. Kate Harrison retired from military service and wrote extensively about the war and the lessons learned, and she argued that eternal vigilance was the price of freedom, and that every generation must choose whether to submit to tyranny or resist. Claire Bennett took command of the new galactic defense force composed of volunteers from liberated species, and she ensured that no one would ever again face extinction because they dared to dream of. Gueda Silva and Nethys watched as the galaxy they helped save grew into something better than what came before, and the ancient elf told her dragon companion that perhaps their long suffering had purpose after all. The story spread across the galaxy of how a single bureaucratic error awakened humanity's wrath and led to the fall of ancient tyranny, and parents told their children that freedom was won not by the strong alone,